Hello, everyone, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for Adopting Multi-Cloud Services with Confidence. I'll just start off today with a couple housekeeping notes. We would like you to submit your questions throughout the entire presentation. We will be collecting those and answering those at the end of the session, but please feel free to submit them through the entire session. That's available within the chat function. Also, we'll have several polls throughout the presentation as well. We encourage you to participate. We'll be loading those one at a time. And we were reviewing those prior to the session, and we noticed I had a little typo here, so I apologize for that first one has a bit of a typo, but I think you'll get the idea. So we'll continue to turn those off and on throughout the presentation, so please respond to those throughout. And then we want to go ahead and get started today, so I'd like to introduce our presenter, Kevin Hakanson, who's Director of Customer Success with OpsCompass. Let's get us started, Kevin.
All right, thanks, Shannon. Yeah, and a reminder, these polls hopefully are going to be fun. So like Shannon mentioned, I'm kind of at OpsCompass here. I kind of lead our customer success org, but I have kind of a background as kind of an enterprise architect, cloud solutions architect. So I'm going to be covering a lot of material in this session today about multi-cloud, just to kind of from that perspective as well. So we'll kind of see how these polls are coming in. It looks like I'm seeing some results in. What I want to do is kind of get the result of this first poll on multi-cloud to see what we're doing. A lot of people think it's a good strategic idea, and some people don't have an opinion. So hoping only got three votes so far of the people on. So gonna wait for a couple more.
We'll let it run just another minute, and we'll go ahead and jump back in here in a sec.
Yeah, so I'm going to move on to the next slide as we're voting, and then Shannon will kind of cut over to the new poll at some point. So if you read everything on the internet, especially this kind of article about multi-cloud being the worst practice, you'd think that's maybe a bad idea. And there was kind of some interesting parts of that article that I decided to call out and share here. And in this article, Corey Quinn, he highlighted that multi-cloud is this idea of building workloads that can seamlessly run across any cloud provider. You know, whether it's your own data centers or other clouds, and you can move them with ease. Right? He calls out specific things like, hey, if you want to be multi-cloud, does that mean you're going to use software like Nginx instead of the load balancers that are native to each platform? He highlights that companies they don't want to hire generalists, right, that are broad across clouds. They really have this bias for specialists with a focus of the skills that are on one platform. And then the last bullet, which was something I actually found interesting, and I don't know that it highlights it's a worst practice or not, but he said multi-cloud often means we're 80% plus in a primary cloud, and then we have a smattering of workloads across other clouds. So when I think about that comment, that 80-20 comment, it makes me think that multi-cloud is just a fact of doing business. You can go visit the vendor documentation for Microsoft Azure, and they will give you an opinion on multi-cloud. Of course, they would probably like you to be their cloud first, and then other workloads. But they talk about containing it to where it's required, based on either technical needs or some specific business requirements, right? And then highlighting about complexity and security risks as you're adopting multi-cloud. So in a list of the possible scenarios that I've seen related to multi-cloud that just kind of happen, the whole merger and acquisition flow. Companies merge together, one company acquires another company, they already have a cloud presence. Maybe it's in one of the different hyperscale cloud providers. Maybe it's in the same cloud provider, but the subscriptions were all set up differently. So there's a scenario where just through doing business, you're going to be multi-cloud, and you maybe didn't intend to be so. Maybe you have targeted workloads. Maybe one of the cloud providers has a certain service that is just so far above the rest. Maybe it's related to some sort of artificial intelligence or machine learning or some data analytics that's just so much better than the other cloud that you want to use that for that target workload. I've had teams that I've worked with where they've had a lot of technology expertise that related to one cloud, and the benefit of running that workload in that cloud outweighed the benefit of trying to standardize on a single cloud. And then kind of an interesting multi-cloud scenario is the cloud migration scenario. Maybe one of the hyperscale cloud providers has incented you to use their cloud, and now you're migrating, either from on-prem to that cloud or from public cloud to public cloud. And now you're effectively running these multi-cloud workloads, at least in that time being, while you're migrating, and maybe forever if there's some workloads that just don't make sense to move. So there's a lot of legit reasons for doing multi-cloud that isn't trying to make portable architectural workloads.
Well, Kevin, a quick update on the poll. It looks like a lot of people agree that it's a good strategic idea at 62%. 25 agree that it's a good tactical idea. No one thinks it's a bad idea, and about 12% don't yet have an opinion. So we'll go ahead and stop this one and open up the next one.
Hey, thanks for that update. And you know what? Maybe the people that thought it's a bad idea wouldn't have signed up to join this presentation, because then they would just come get online to heckle. So it's good. It's good that I probably won't have heckling questions at the end about it being a bad idea. When I was talking about what I'm kind of going to talk about today, I put these definitions for cloud native and for cloud agnostic related to this presentation. And there's different, depending on your context, you might have different definitions. But for this, I wanted to refer to cloud native as building applications and using services that were specific to a cloud platform. And cloud agnostic, or cloud neutral, if you've heard that term, about building applications which can be moved between cloud platforms or using services independent of a cloud platform. And those services could be things you create yourself, it could be open source software, or it could be a SaaS provider like OpsCompass, my employer, that works across multi-cloud. So there's a couple differences or things that are cloud agnostic. To drill into just a couple examples, when I compare cloud native and cloud agnostic with those definitions, I decided to look at the infrastructure as code space, and looking at source code repositories, CI/CD pipelines, and then infrastructure as code templates. With source code repos, there's a Git protocol that almost everybody uses today, and you can be cloud agnostic and just host yourself in GitHub or one of those other providers, or you could actually host right in the cloud native solution to those as those Git repositories. In CI/CD pipelines, a similar story. Each of the cloud providers has their own pipeline or cloud build product, or you can go cloud agnostic. You either use something hosted like GitHub Actions or Circle CI, or maybe take Jenkins and run it on your own VMs in your clouds. When it comes to infrastructure as code templates, things I think end up being the most unique. Something like a Terraform is multi-cloud. It lets you use the same kind of language structure to be able to construct multi-cloud things. There is custom providers for each cloud, but technologies like AWS CloudFormation or Azure Resource Manager might both use JSON as a language structure, but they're totally different custom syntaxes on top of them. So you don't get a lot of reuse or the ability to kind of be cross-cloud on those. So just a couple examples as I wanted to just highlight when I think about kind of cloud native versus cloud agnostic. How are we doing?
Well, it looks like of the votes
poll?
so far, 100% are saying that IT and business are co-leading their cloud adoption strategy, but it looks like we can leave it open here for another few minutes for folks to continue to vote.
Okay. Yeah, this is an interesting one, and this may be somewhat as reflective of how long you've been in cloud and where it started with. I think early in cloud, I feel like IT orgs were kind of doing the pushing, and now a lot of the hype has happened, and there's a lot more partnership in place. So, I'm going to kind of next then talk about cloud adoption frameworks, which of course are kind of key to these cloud adoption strategies. And each of these, I've got some thumbnails of each of the different clouds, you know, images of their cloud adoption framework. And each of the major cloud providers has one, and they all have a similar set of things. They have this guidance, they have tools, they have best practices. And they're intended to help your organization kind of align, you know, your technical and business strategies in your quest to adopt the cloud successfully. Kind of in the following slides, I'm going to drill into some of the, I think, the key things about each of the different cloud adoption frameworks from the various cloud providers. AWS came up with their cloud adoption framework first before all of the public cloud providers, and of course they were the first cloud, so this does make sense. It was created by their professional services group, and it was really meant to kind of get people, you know, onto AWS. And they organized theirs into these 6 areas of focus called perspectives. And they even shaded them as kind of business focuses and then, like, you know, technology focuses. And each of these, then you drill into the docket. It's very structured, right? These perspectives are made out of capabilities, talking about, you know, who owns and manages things. These capabilities have specific guidances related to skills that you need to acquire and related to processes that you should put in place. And a lot of this was geared to creating an action plan and work streams to get your adoption to cloud. So I feel like some of this structure to me comes from a time when people were still trying to convince themselves to adopt cloud. And there's some relevant stuff here today, but it's just kind of like that historical take is just kind of an interesting perspective on it. The Google Cloud Architecture Framework is a little different. They built it on the people, process, technology kind of triangle or rubric. And then they use the overlapping areas between them to highlight some different themes. And you might not be able to see it easily kind of on this slide, but the links are available to go directly to these things kind of in the area to the right, I guess, on my screen. But you know, these 4 themes that they have kind of like evolve, if you read the documentation, over your phases of cloud maturity. So they've had, you know, a tactical, a strategic, and a transformational phase of maturity, and then the things you would need to do in your learn, lead, scale, and secure changed over that time. The one that I kind of highlighted with the little yellow marker was that external experience. Just being something that, like, as you're moving to a new cloud, you don't want to lose time trying to learn things fast. Getting going and talking to some external experts really help, and it's the reason that you're coming to presentations like this today, to get kind of different perspectives and give you tips on things to look at. The last cloud adoption framework I want to talk about, I would say, is kind of my favorite one because of the completeness of it, and it's kind of ongoing evolution and stuff that's constantly being added to it, and that's you know, Microsoft provides also a lot of best practices, documentation, and tools. They also help you align with strategies. But the thing that I like the most about it is they don't kind of refer to as the structure of things you need to do to get set up in cloud, but more as a full life cycle framework, kind of supporting you through kind of every phase of adoption. And if you look closely at that diagram, you see it's circular. After I'm adopting cloud workloads, it flows back into managing and governing them, becoming ready to do kind of more in the cloud, and then adopting more cloud workloads. So I really like the life cycle flow of the cloud adoption framework, and it's definitely something that you could apply to any cloud or multi-cloud. So you come up with a good strategy like this, and then you can tie in a lot of your multi-cloud strategies to it. So kind of as a summary, each of these frameworks, it has, you know, it's got a different approach, and it adds value to that ongoing conversation about multi-cloud. You know, they all three have this, you know, understanding that between business and IT, alignment is needed for successful cloud adoption. and it looks like most of you do kind of agree with that in the poll, or at least that's who has led it. People in their ability to grow technology skills and kind of changing their behaviors and processes. Okay, that's likely going to be your limiting factor. They all call out things like learn, they call out things like planning. That's going to be kind of a factor you need to consider. And then just my ongoing reminder that security, it always plays this central and ongoing role during cloud adoption, right? And this is only compounded by a multi-cloud strategy, because now you have multiple clouds and paradigms of security that you need to kind of think about and deal with. So let's, I'm going to go back to the list and let's see how we're doing on our next poll.
Yeah, it looks like so far 2/3 of folks are saying that they don't have a substantial opinion on the Cloud Center of Excellence, with 1/3 saying they have a positive opinion. So that'll be interesting as you go through your slides. Potentially not everyone refers to Cloud Center of Excellence the same manner. So it'll be interesting to kind of see how you define that for everyone.
Yeah, thanks for that, because that's kind of what I was thinking. There's a lot of customers that I end up talking to, and it's a term that they've maybe heard, but it's not something that's been adopted. And part of what I'm covering in this presentation is some of what that even means and what it means to different people. So I've grouped a lot of things together in just what I'm calling kind of organizational cloud adoption. Didn't want to headline this as Cloud Center of Excellence because that isn't necessarily kind of the end state that makes sense for everyone. Again, from the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, a lot of good material here that's applicable to multi-cloud. They call out kind of these required cloud adoption functions, and they highlight a lot of things that you need to do when you're in the cloud, independent of how they're organized. And we'll see a couple of models in the following slides related to how they're organized. I have put some little yellow bookmarks next to 2 of them because I'm going to be kind of highlighting those later in some conversations. The cloud adoption function, and that is the one group or function that delivers technical solutions. They're the ones putting your workloads in the cloud. Maybe you might think of it as your DevOps teams or your delivery teams. And then the other one I've highlighted is the cloud platform. And that's the group that they operate the cloud, they mature the platform of the cloud. They're kind of the gatekeepers or the custodians of how the cloud is set up. But in addition to those 2, you'll see there's strategy, and there's governance, and there's operations, and automation and security. A bunch of other functions that are important. Maybe Cloud Center Excellence is one of them. Maybe you have a central IT team, and that's kind of part of it too. Those all kind of play into adopting cloud and the functions that your organization needs to do, both for a single cloud and absorbing in a multi-cloud scenario. So from the Microsoft kind of documentation again that we're going to be seeing a couple slides on it, they really talk about the Cloud Center of Excellence is really the end node on this maturation stage cycle. So you'll start with adoption and you'll maybe flow from left to right and maybe get to Cloud Center of Excellence at the end. Right? They recommend that you at least start with the MVP best practices. Okay? So don't just start with the cloud adoption team, but at least start with 2 separate kind of teams or functions that are dedicated to people. Your cloud adoption team, right, responsible for those technical solutions or workloads, right, and for operating them as they're adopted at this point, at this phase. And then another group that's responsible for your platform maturity, your operations of the platform, your governance, and the automation. So kind of in this phase, that's the recommended starting point. So you just don't have kind of one group doing some cloud to the side. Now, hopefully by the time you're multi-cloud, you're not still kind of in this MVP mode. So the next phase that is where maybe a lot of organizations kind of, I would say, get kind of stop at or end up being their target is central IT. And central IT maybe is the group that already has a lot of subject matter expertise in operations and administration, in automation and security. Maybe they've been running your on-prem data center for years. They understand how to do stuff. They're staffed. They have the processes. A move to cloud, gives this team an opportunity to grow and adapt, or it becomes a threat to kind of their existing model of how they work. And one of the challenges, because this is really one of the riskiest phases of the organizational maturity, is are they forcing alignment like with on-premises? The way that they do cloud, they want to do cloud the same way they did on-prem. Or in the case of multi-cloud, they want to do AWS the same way they did Azure, even though they're different. So those are some of the things that make this kind of the risky behavior. So again, some companies stop here, some companies do this well, but this is just something to kind of understand and be able to recognize. The target end state is this cloud center of excellence, and this is how it's defined there. They call it the modern cloud-first operating model, right? A lot to do with self-service of these cloud adoption teams, but saying you do need some of that centralized kind of governance, the platform, the automation, the security. Those roles all fall into kind of a cloud center of excellence, taking on those functions, or at least being the proxy for those functions. What's tough on a cloud center of excellence is it does require that agreement between the business and IT leadership to be able to modernize these processes. Some of the cases I've kind of seen that be the most legacy is around the budgeting process. The cloud is ephemeral. You can spin up resources. You can take on projects. There's a lot of agility to cloud. But some organizations still are on an annual budget cycle. So from the business side, they're only as agile as every 12 months. But from the IT side, now they're adopting modern practices. So if there's some conflict in your organization, right, it's going to be hard to kind of move to a full cloud model like this. And it's unlikely to occur, right, unless you have some executive support and you have some vision behind kind of making that organal change, getting that business agility in place to be able to fully leverage a cloud center of excellence. Let's see how our next poll is coming along here. So I'm
far,
really
in regards
curious.
To security, yeah. It looks like it's about 50-50 right now, which is interesting. Each cloud customer workload team has the most responsibility, and then the other is everyone is equally responsible. About 50-50 split at this point, but we'll give people a little bit more time to respond. But that's not what I anticipated, so I'm curious your take on that, Kevin.
Yeah, I'm glad no one said the cloud provider is the most responsible. What's kind of interesting with that, and this is a real interesting question. The cloud provider does do a lot of work, and they have so many more security people than the rest of us. But whenever I think about it, I think about the customer is the most responsible, right? And which part of the customer, right? So that's why it's interesting. I don't know that there is like a wrong answer on this slide. This is just kind of one that I feel kind of curious, and we'll kind of see how as some other people are voting, we'll see how that comes in. But one of the topics that we're going to talk about, and this has been around for a while, so I'm sure a lot of you have seen this or heard of this. It's called the shared responsibility model, right? And the shared responsibility model isn't as much about being equally responsible as kind of being both responsible. And kind of in the associated links here, you'll be able to kind of go visit a blog post I wrote that has the direct links to each of these four kind of diagrams and the supporting commentary around them. But for purposes of this picture, I just wanted to kind of put them all side by side just to call out kind of a couple things that were the same. They all have the cloud provider in them and the cloud customer in them, right? And they both kind of all highlight that. Way down at the bottom, you can see that like physical things like servers or data centers or the hardware, is always on kind of the cloud provider, right? And you'll also see that everybody but AWS. Now, as AWS came with theirs first, right? So it's kind of, don't want to pick on somebody for being first, but the subsequent providers decided to actually split out infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service in their responsibility models, just to show the different degrees of responsibility that you have. The infrastructure as a service on all of them has the most responsibility for the customer, because you're putting the virtual machine in there, you're putting the OS on there, you're responsible for patching. And that's the place where you have the most control, because you're running everything yourself, but you also have the most responsibility. Some teams, when they want to do multi-cloud and they want to make it cloud agnostic, they think, I'm just going to deploy everything to Linux servers, and I got a common image across them, I'm just going to push it out there, and that's how I'm going to be able to understand it the best. But you can flip that to, if I use platform as a service, or even sometimes software as a service, I now have less control over what's happening, but because I've got some isolated functionality that I'm using, but now I have less security I have to deal with. So there is really a trade-off across the levels for how much control you want, for how much responsibility for the security you want. So the last thing I'd like to highlight on this slide, and I put a little yellow box around all of them, data shows up at the top of everybody's chart, right? It's information and data, it's customer data, it's data like it's content, right? They're all, they all put data at the top, highlight the fact that you as a customer are responsible for your data. That doesn't change across clouds. That's the same across clouds. Again, these are the diagrams here from the 3 different cloud providers, as well as the one in the upper left is actually from the Center for Information Security. They kind of have a more generic model of the shared responsibility model version of it. So, looks like workload teams came out on top in the poll, huh? So, okay. Let's now kind of drill down into, when we talk about the customer, sometimes I feel like that isn't enough of a split. So groups that I work with oftentimes have a platform team, and that platform team is responsible for something that's often called landing zone. And the landing zone term it's a term that has been used kind of both by Azure and by AWS, and it's really the kind of the multi-subscription or the multi-account environment setup. It includes even like how the accounts are set up. Are they all set up the same way? What's the hierarchy of these accounts being set up? Are the same policies or best practices being applied to them all? And you want to, as you're adding, being a larger org, adding new kind of cloud accounts, you want them to have some of the same kind of security controls and principles in there. So the customer then really has got, I say, like a split set of responsibility. The platform team is responsible for security kind of the landing zone inside of their tenant. And then the workload teams, I feel, are responsible for things that are deployed in those landing zones. So it's a split responsibility. So again, it kind of goes to that everyone's equally responsible answer. But as the other thing that gets highlighted too is you can't wait for your cloud platform team to get everything 100% done before you start doing workloads. But you don't want to get too many workloads out there before you've matured your landing zones and your security and your governance to work. So again, the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework here has got a very nice kind of diagram that kind of parallels the cloud adoption of the workload teams with the cloud platform teams, and how you need to evolve how your landing zones work, as well as the security on them and the governance on them. And this is hard to do with one cloud and one set of landing zones. But now as your platform team needs to adopt multiple clouds, now am I maturing the landing zones in AWS, but now my ones in Azure advancing. So that's kind of the choices and the tough things you have to understand there. So again, it goes to, do I focus most of my knowledge on one of the clouds and maybe bring in some external expertise on the second cloud? Do I have the workload teams help me out more? You know, how am I gonna make sure that I'm maturing those things and keeping up with governance and security? So kind of thinking about it as kind of phases and building up is really important. It's gotta, you know, everything has to get done before I can get my first workload out there. Now, when I kind of talk governance too, I like to even throw like a third layer in there. So we've been talking about platform teams and workload teams, right? Where the platform teams are working on those standards and policies that are across all workloads, right? And the hierarchy of the cloud accounts. And the adoption teams are the ones doing the workloads, are the ones making those detailed decisions, right? About the implementations, about their services, their applications used, their workloads. And they're always doing that within the context of the corporate kind of, or the platform governance. But many times there's kind of a layer in between where some adoption teams are grouped together. So I just kind of referring to that as kind of your regional or your business unit IT teams. They're the ones that kind of have a bunch of similar workloads grouped together. Maybe it's by customer. And they might add some extra policies or standards that they have related to things that they want to, how they want to do business, how they want to do some security or some governance that might be additive on top of the corporate, and have all the workload teams below them be adopted. So that's, again, it's important in multi-cloud to kind of think that way, and maybe that regional IT team says, you know what, we're only doing it in this one cloud because this is the only cloud that's got data centers that are in my geopolitical region that has sovereignty, so I want to adopt this cloud because they have a better footprint in my region for data residency reasons, for all sorts of different kind of non-technical reasons. So there's definitely decisions that those groups like to make that aren't the same as what a global corporate company might make. The I mentioned that each of the cloud providers, you know, has got different names for things. So in AWS, your kind of unit of where I put my cloud resources, it's called an account. And it was the first thing AWS came out with was a cloud, you know, an account. In GCP, their parallel item is a project. And in Azure, that same kind of line is a subscription. So Azure was a little unique in that Azure subscriptions had a layer below them called a resource group that was a scope that you could assign policies and permissions to that was separate, and it really made it easy to organize resources, more resources in an Azure subscription than it would have been to organize stuff in AWS. There wasn't that same nice way to kind of segment those things in AWS. But each of these, because of the limitations related to kind of that organizing below the account or project or subscription level, they've added a hierarchy on top. They all have some sort of organization support, and then some sort of layer underneath the organization, whether it's a management group in Azure or it's an organizational unit in AWS, a way to kind of define a hierarchy of how your accounts are set up, and to apply policies and security to different layers of this, whether it's to an account level or even to one of these mid-level kind of organizational unit levels. So this is kind of and one of these important concepts to realize that all the cloud providers have something similar. They use different names, but some of the implementation details are different on this one. So it gets to be, you know, again, one of these things that's important for that Cloud Center of Excellence to be able to understand and be able to kind of help the business and help the workload teams understand. And I've got some thoughts on how you would organize those those hierarchy. It's a kind of a callback to something that showed up in a lot of presentations about 10 years ago called Conway's Law. And this came up a lot when people were talking about microservices architecture and splitting workloads. And you know, people then referred to this kind of older quote that talks about oftentimes when you design a system, right, and that's kind of a broad definition, you'll end up designing it in a way that kind of mimics your organizational structure. And the same thing can happen in this type of cloud account management group structure. So just kind of a thought is you don't need to mirror your org structure when you're setting up these kind of cloud accounts, right? And one of the best examples for that is if you do it that way, right, what problems does a future reorg or a merger and acquisition scenario leave you with, right? I have an example of a company that had kind of 3 big main business units, and they did a divestment of one of the business units. They took the other 2 and they split it into 3 because they wanted to just kind of do it, segment it on customers differently. Well, those 2 that were split into 3, you know, had shared accounts where they had workloads in it. And now there was either the challenge of, well, now I need to either move these workloads into some new accounts so we have the right security, or I need to grant some permission. So there became now, the business change became now kind of an IT tech debt problem. What would have been a better start was if there was a little more of a hierarchy and some more accounts, and they were organized kind of or segmented by workload. Because in that way, then in one of those kind of reorganization flows, the different accounts could just be moved inside the hierarchy and kind of maintain their individual kind of security and data. So if you're going to kind of refactor your multi-cloud structure, or you're going to set it up for the first time, really think about what might happen in the future, and if organizing by workload might have some value for you. Going to talk a little here now about some of the phases of kind of the govern flow, and I'm kind of going to focus on kind of the bottom part of the slide. And again, this you can see from the source link is another one of the great resources from the Microsoft Azure Cloud Adoption Framework. But when they talk about cloud governance, they highlight these 5 disciplines. And we look at them and we recognize them. Cost management, yes, we want to do it. Both a security baseline and an identity baseline, right? Those are important to kind of understand what the baseline is, that you can actually see then what's changing or what's drifting from that baseline. Getting some sort of resource consistency, having things kind of look the same and be the same, or at least be able to understand them or have some visibility into them the same way. And then just being able to kind of get some faster deployment into the cloud. So these kind of 5 disciplines, you know, these are actually good to do multi-cloud, understand them across cloud. And that's, again, like a lot of the theme of this presentation is you can take one of the cloud providers' information and you can apply the good policies and decisions and thoughts and workflows across your entire multi-cloud estate, or possibly even into your on-prem estate if you're doing kind of hybrid cloud. One of my favorite consistent topics I like to touch on is tagging, and this is the tagging of cloud resources. And this is pretty simple, right? Tags are almost as simple as you can get. You know, you have a user-defined key and you have a value, and you attach them to your resources as metadata. So I can just tag a resource, give it some context so I can look at it easier. You know, they help you organize your resources, right? They enable the functions we saw earlier. They enable the cost management, right? They enable the, you know, the email automation and access control. So that tags can help you. And tags are, you know, they can be IT aligned, right? They can tag the workload. They can tag the environment. Is it prod or is it non-prod? They can tag, you know, the specific function or applications kind of inside workloads. Or these tags, they can be business aligned, right? They can be an accounting or a cost center number, right? They can talk maybe about which of the regional business, you know, units own something, or which division of your company, or something related to an external facing product. Or they can just tag your criticality. Like if it's one of your bread and butter software products, it might be a high business criticality. But if it's just some sort of internal tooling that's just kind of a during the workday system, or maybe it doesn't need to be online only at the end of the month, that might be a low business criticality. And that helps your operation teams kind of understand how they need to respond to things. Or if a security event happens, like how does that relate to the business criticality? So again, tags, they can be IT line, they can be business line. It's a pretty simple concept of keys and values. So if I'm a Cloud Center of Excellence team and I'm defining a multi-cloud strategy, hey, this sounds like this would just be easy. But that same group needs to now dig into the details of that implementation. And in AWS, Azure, and GCP, there's different limitations on how they do stuff. Maybe it's the, what they're even called. GCP calls them labels. There's a limit how many you can have on a resource. You know, there's a length of the key limit, whether it's case sensitive or not, right? There's actually some reserved prefixes in AWS, it's AWS:, and in Azure, it's either Microsoft Azure or Windows. So you can't, your tags can't start with that. The most challenging thing is the characters that are valid or invalid for each of these providers. And those of us that had started with AWS and we used colons as a prefix, early Azure didn't allow colon. That was added later. So that became like, oh, that didn't work. Some third-party providers that pulled in your tags thought colon was the split between key and value. So that caused problems. So the different characters can cause problems. GCP, probably because they came last with it, has got the most restrictive. They just allow lowercase, numeric, underscore, hyphen, right? And you have to start with a lowercase letter. So they kind of got out of the, except for underscore and hyphen, out of the special character game and made it simpler. But if you're putting a strategy together that's multi-cloud, is it the same tagging strategy for all the clouds? Is it different by cloud? And if you've already defined it once you went into one cloud, now as you adopt it to multi-cloud, you're going to have to figure out what to do there. Maybe it's changing it. Maybe it's just adopting two different strategies. But kind of my thoughts related to this in general is you should really define this early, right? And if I had to give an actual recommendation on kind of how to name your tags, I would just say use lowercase Bob case. Okay, it's maybe boring, but the nice thing is you don't need to use your shift key at all. So it makes typing with one hand easier. You can, define a prefix strategy of yourself, right? And you have a standard maybe for your kind of platform team, your corporation team. Maybe you have a standard for your workload team. Okay, do you want to do both teams get to do prefix? Does one team get to do a prefix? Or, do they both? So coming up with that strategy is important because this allows teams to combine their standards or project standards with the organizational strategies and not have conflict. Make sure you're leveraging the cloud native tooling because you want to use both reactive controls and proactive controls. In your infrastructure as code, you're going to want to try and enforce tagging. In your policies or AWS config rules, you're going to want to kind of detect tagging that wasn't there. And then you're also going to want to use some of the tools after the fact to run compliance reports and look at everything. Something that can actually get an inventory of everything you have in the cloud, maybe actually hopefully even across multiple clouds, and be able to show you all the resources across all your clouds that don't hit your tagging standards. That's probably the panacea of reporting. And then, I don't know if you need to understand or have sympathy or anger, but cloud providers are not internally consistent, right? Some services that are released still don't launch with tag support, so you can't tag them. Many don't allow you to tag it when you create it, which means you can't put restrictions on non-tag creation. You have to be able to create stuff, and then hopefully somebody's going to come back and tag it later, right, and then report on it. Or there's other limitations based on number of tags, characters, and tags. So even if you come up with the greatest standard that works across clouds, there's going to be even some service level inconsistency that you're going to have to understand and deal with. Okay, the kind of last section coming up here that I want to talk about is the different well-architected frameworks. And this is one that started out with AWS had a well-architected framework. It was some PDF documents that you could download. This is about 5 years ago or so. There was only 4 pillars at the time. Eventually, they had an internal tool that you could run through. They turned around and back in November 2017 added a fifth pillar, added operational excellence. Had some now tooling that you could actually do yourself as I think as an enterprise customer. And recently, just in May of this year, Microsoft Azure standardized on the same kind of 5 naming standards. They had kind of some similar concepts but different naming in their cloud adoption framework, and in Build this year they released an online tool for assessments of your well-architected, if your workloads are well-architected. And then Google Cloud is very similar. They add some things to security. They group performance and cost optimization together. But you'll see in general, the cloud providers are all aligned, right? So you think, okay, this is another thing where the cloud providers are the same. They almost even have the same names. Maybe I've come here to my multi-cloud panacea. But as you dig into each of these pillars or each of the details, a lot of the things in a well-architected framework for a cloud provider kind of talk about the architecture specific to their cloud, because that's what's going to help. As an example, I decided just to kind of grab some quotes from the security pillar of each of these well-architected frameworks. So in AWS, they have like 6 design principles is how they've set up security. In Azure, they actually have 14 design principles in place related to their security pillars. And they actually highlight the CIA triad, or confidentiality, integrity, availability. Google actually talks about 4 strategies and 7 best practices. So what's interesting here is each of these cloud providers does security well, and they have expertise in security. But the way that they think about it differently means that actually reviewing each of these sections across the pillars is going to help kind of your organization kind of approach multi-cloud differently, and understand maybe if there's one thing a certain cloud provider is stronger at, they're going to have a different best practice, and they're going to have kind of a less of a concern in that principle. So it's kind of an interesting way if you go into each of these just to kind of compare which each cloud provider thinks is important, and then maybe pull them together for how you would want to do security. Since we're in kind of the well-architected area, and we want to talk about application architecture, one of the items from my past when we've talked about that is when we're building up applications, try and build the architecture so it's cloud agnostic, right? And as a database, Postgres was often represented as, hey, we should use Postgres because it's open source and each of the cloud providers support it. So in this scenario, Postgres, you could run Postgres on your own VMs, host it yourself, run it, and maybe that's the most cloud agnostic you want to be. Or you could use the cloud native platform versions that support Postgres. Things like Amazon's RDS for Postgres or Azure Database for Postgres. They're running actual Postgres, right? It's open source. They're running it. They've made some changes to it. They're hosting it. They're taking care of all the management for it, letting it get updated, letting it get backed up, right? So that's, that kind of sits in this column that I say, okay, it's the service is cloud native, but the protocol is really like kind of cloud agnostic. Contrast that with something like Amazon DynamoDB or Firestore on the Google Cloud Platform, which were built from the ground up, cloud native database services. There's no way you can run it yourself. Those scale really well. They do their capability very well, but they only work on that cloud. And then kind of a similar thought is like a MongoDB, right? Just the GPL licensing on it means that the cloud providers don't actually run real MongoDB, but they run something that's compatible with the MongoDB protocol. So when you're kind of defining what what your strategy is for your architecture. This is the thing that your Cloud Center of Excellence should do across clouds, especially if, if they've made a statement like what's kind of a preferred database provider. One of the other examples I've had from my past where things were kind of confusing was moving from cloud to cloud. I had a team that was doing some tests. I told them to use a load balancer. This is a team that had AWS experience, and now we were testing some Azure to see if it's got the same scaling because we were thinking about moving a workload. They spun up a load balancer, but unfortunately it was a web application, and I was expecting them to spin up a application load balancer like I was used to in AWS, because the classic load balancer had always supported kind of the HTTP layer and that type of routing and load balancing. So we ended up getting some mixed results on the way that the round robin algorithm happened for the load balancer, because it was based on the source IP import and not an affinity cookie that went in the browser, right? So just kind of referring to something generically as a load balancer caused my team problems, and it delayed us for a couple of weeks trying to understand why we weren't getting the distribution across servers that we thought we would. And from that point on, I was like, proper names and URLs, right, are always been my friend, so I know exactly what it is we're deploying. So a team isn't saying, hey, I'm doing this again. Maybe looking at the infrastructure as code might be another way of solving that. But as you're kind of designing a solution, making sure that you kind of know the details on the technology and how it works. So it looks like the latest poll has got some results coming in here.
Yep, looks like it's about a 50-50 split between the cloud adoption framework and the shared responsibility model as far as which model or framework they found most useful. So that's an interesting result.
So we opened that up early, so we kind of hadn't got to some of the well-architected content yet here. Although for multi-cloud, again, it's, is that the most useful or not? So okay, those are some good and interesting results. So kind of as we're kind of coming to the end here, I wanted to kind of put this picture together. And I've taken the different elements of the different cloud adoption frameworks and thrown in the well-architected framework and the shared responsibility model, highlighted that business and IT have a split, but even in IT, kind of the platform teams and the workload teams have a split, and kind of laid out the different kind of phases or pillars or groups of the cloud adoption frameworks together just kind of on one slide. And really highlighting the stuff that straddles that line, the security, going with it, the shared responsibility, and then kind of the learning or keeping your skills up to date are really things that straddle platform teams and workload teams, and are important for kind of everyone to, kind of know what's going on and be able to kind of get the most kind of help from each other on that one. So kind of the thoughts and how it kind of would pull them together and organize them. And with some closing thoughts here, I'd like to kind of reiterate to you, and I've said this before, that people kind of in their skills, right? That's going to be your limiting factor, right? As you're going multi-cloud, and a lot of times you need to focus on your workloads and your business outcomes, right? Your Cloud Center of Excellence team or whatever team that's kind of on that platform side, right? They need to have that visibility into multi-cloud, right? Including security, including governance, right? And it's going to be across all your workloads, right? And not just kind of VMs or IaaS, right? But infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and even some of the software as a service providers that kind of help you on your multi-cloud journey. Okay? And then, related back to that external experience that Google calls out, I also reiterate, if you're doing this, find some sort of independent, trusted partner, right? Maybe it's a consultant, maybe it's a software vendor, right? Who focuses a lot of their time thinking about multi-cloud, and get an assist, ask for some help. Just help accelerate your cloud adoption so you can focus on those workloads and business outcomes. And with that, I'd just like to kind of say thank you, and we'll see. I don't know if we've got any kind of questions coming in from the audience or... Yeah,
it looks like we just have a couple. We'll see if we can sneak them in here real quick. The first one is, they're asking for some guidance around common mistakes that people have made so they can try and avoid those mistakes. So I know you told a couple stories throughout, but if you have maybe one more example to share with folks.
Mistakes, yeah, I think a lot of that goes to it's making assumptions, right? That the clouds are the same or things are named the same. Is I think like the biggest mistake that people make, and they don't make it intentionally, right? It's an awareness factor. So that's a tough one. And the other one that comes up, and that goes to well-architected, is trying to be cloud agnostic or building workloads that are portable just because somebody thinks it's a good idea, right? And kind of really understanding what that means or not. There is some truth that if you're on a single cloud, you get more of that cloud provider's attention and you get more help from that cloud provider. So kind of a mistake might be just kind of assuming the default that multi-cloud is better without actually really sitting and thinking down it and thinking about it from a workload point of view.
Great. And then the other question that has come in so far is in regards to managing security across cloud environments and that concern, and is there an easier way to find a way to manage that security and governance across cloud?
The security and governance is never easy. So, here's a couple answers that aren't helpful. Go hire a lot of really good security people, right? They're expensive and they're hard to find. Okay, that's not necessarily a great answer. I think another answer, just because we're a software vendor that deals with security and governance, is get some software like OpsCompass to help. The biggest thing though is really about kind of pushing that learning and shared responsibility. If you're going to do something internally, it's really just highlighting to people that workload teams, you're responsible. It's not a platform team. It's not the cloud. It's not a security, information security org. It's kind of getting people to kind of buy into it. But even better than getting some sort of visibility into as soon as things go wrong or become insecure, you want to let those teams know, hopefully before it gets too long, because maybe they're on the next sprint or iteration and they don't have time to fix it. So those are a couple comments related to that.
Those are some good points. Well, those are the questions that came in so far, and we're rapidly closing out the hour. So I just wanted to also share that Kevin mentioned his blog earlier in the presentation. We do have a link to that, and within that blog, he has links to the well-architected framework, the shared responsibility model, and the cloud adoption frameworks, as well as some others. And then we included some other attachments and links throughout the presentation as well. So please check those out. We also welcome feedback from the audience. Tell us what you like. Tell us what you'd like to hear less of, what you'd like to hear more of. We want to take that feedback as we adapt further presentations for you guys. And then that's the big things for me. Kevin, do you have any closing comments for us?
No, I just have fun in multi-cloud, be secure out there, go cloud.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and have a great remainder of your day. Thanks.